Hi, my name is Marcin Żebrowski, and this is my podcast about cities, Urbcast. Hi, and welcome to the newest episode of Urbcast. This is also the last episode of this season in English, so welcome to the grand finale. Today I will be having 3 guests at the same time. Matthew Burnett, Iddo and Andre Sanchez Montoya form together Make Room. Make Room is a consultancy that provides insights across the entire building industry value chain to enable sufficient living. They utilize data-driven processes to ensure healthy, sustainable, and inclusive communities that can live well within the ecological limits of the planet. Matthew, Iddo, and Andre are 3 recent graduates of the Strategic Design and Entrepreneurship Program, which is a joint program between the Royal Danish Academy and Copenhagen Business School. This is where they first met, and when they decided to create master thesis together, the master thesis about their idea of Make Room was developed into the startup, into the consultancy firm that provides the insights about how to live in the sufficient way. The obvious thing is that building industry is responsible for the largest share of CO2 emissions and resource consumption on the planet. By the same time, Denmark has one of the highest floor area per person on the planet, and it is forecasted that 113 million square meters of new development are expected to be built in Denmark by 2050. But first, do Danes really need this much of space per person? And the second thing is that do we really need to build new buildings in our cities, contributing to even bigger biodiversity loss and bigger CO2 production? The simplified explanation of the project of Make Room is that Andre, Matthew, and Iddo propose to transform existing buildings to create more healthy and livable housing. They introduced the term of sufficiency as a part of new approach towards sustainability. We are talking about the ecological ceiling, about the social floor, as well as different data-informed insights. What if we can occupy less space, live more flexible, and also in a more shared way? We talk about some paradigm shifts and what the 3 speculative futures for the project can be. We talk about 3 different visions, about the subtle one, a more meaningful one, and also radical sufficiency transition. The idea of the project, which will be shortly introduced to you by my guests, is about decreasing the amount of space that we all have in our flats to be able to accommodate more people and also to provide more shared facilities. By 2050, Copenhagen's population is expected to increase by 130,000 people. If we don't build new spaces and instead make room within the existing building stock, we could house everyone by simply reducing floor area per person by 7 square meters. Is it possible? Let me ask the founders of Make Room. Welcome. Thank you for coming to Urbcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And we are very excited to be here.
Yes, thank you, Marcin.
This is very exciting for me because this is the first time I will have actually 3 guests at my show. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation. But before we jump into the main topic of our episode today, I just wanted to ask you guys, can you briefly introduce yourselves?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Matthew, and I'm an architect and strategic designer, originally from Australia. So it's a long way to be here in Denmark, but I've been studying here for the past 2 years, and I've just graduated now. And now I'm starting a company with these 2 lovely individuals next to me.
Hi there. My name is Andre Sanchez Montoya. I'm from the US, originally from New Mexico. I'm a recent graduate from CBS and KDK here in Copenhagen from the Strategic Design and Entrepreneurship Program.
And yes, hi. I'm Iddo, originally from Israel, architect, mainly focused on residential projects and retrofitting, also a strategic designer, and with a focus on the built environment innovation.
So how did it happen that you meet together? You've been studying the same program and you managed to do the master thesis together. What happened and how did it start with you joining forces and the product, which is probably not the final product yet, or a startup that you launched is Make Room. But what is the kind of this very brief story behind it?
Yeah, sure. Like you said, it started with us essentially completing the same master's program together. And we all have multidisciplinary backgrounds. So some of us are architects and some of us are also have a background in international development and business. And so we really loved working together along this graduate program. We had lots of really interdisciplinary courses together and a lot of group and teamwork. As we kind of developed our third semester projects throughout our course, we kind of saw that there was a lot of alignment in our interests and what we really loved doing and what we were motivated by. So I was completing a sort of digital platform to like look at and study residents in housing. And some others were doing really similar things. Like we had Iddo, who was working on also flexible dwelling concepts. We had Andre looking at human-centered design approaches quite a lot. And so we kind of naturally just like came together in some sort of conglomeration at some point over a few beers.
Yeah, it actually started, I think, our first official meeting in discussing if we're going to collaborate and do the thesis together, what I think was in my living room. We had kind of like a small interview session. It's like, where do you want to take this project and what are your thoughts? And where do you want to position the project within the theoretical, I think, landscape in general? Because we did see through previous work, just to say that the program is 2 years, 4 semesters. And we saw alignment along the way between us. Me personally, I haven't worked with Andre and Matt until that point. Just to say that Andre and Matt worked together and they kind of knew each other through that. So I had a feeling more like, are they going to add a third person? Because they already, at that point, I think they already agreed that they're going to collaborate between them. And there was a question if I'm joining or not. I think what really helped, and I think Matt touched upon it, it's like the third semester project that we saw a lot of similarities, a lot of overlaps between the projects that we have developed independently. And we were excited about the potential of what can we do together, because we have a more or less complementary abilities focus. And we thought this connection would be very fruitful.
And I think realizing that the capability of our combined skills, we would really be able to achieve something very unique, and we would be able to challenge, different viewpoints in the building industry, different perspectives within sustainability by having our, this convergence of all three of us. It really opened up the possibilities of, how dynamic could our project be and how much could we be provocative with our three minds compared to maybe just two or one. So it was an easy decision to bring Iddo into the fold. And, I think ever since then, it's been such a great trifecta.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that like we really wanted to practice what we were like learning in our course, which is about interdisciplinary work and collaboration. And so it was kind of important for us to do that from the get-go with the company.
And I think in a structure of one semester thesis, in general, it seems quite hard to create a meaningful body of work. And by collaborating 3 people, I think that was also the motivation there, that we can actually create something that is meaningful and it's rounded and it's kind of solidified to that level that we wanted and inspired. We didn't want to kind of waste time in exploring something that maybe wouldn't be able to move forward or will be too speculative.
The reason I also wanted to talk to you is that I'm very excited about this mix of knowledge and practical experience that you have, because it's architecture, it's a bit of business development and sustainability, and also 3 different countries, 3 different contexts. And this amazes me. And I'm really happy that there are projects like this, that they are combining this knowledge. Going forward, I wanted to ask you about this main story and also the main concept behind the Make Room. Before we, of course, go further with talking about the whole problem, what was the main incentive for creating a Make Room?
Yeah, I think a lot of it stems from this idea of, we're at this inflection point with so many different companies and industries needing to move towards net zero or decarbonization strategies. And a lot of this means that you have to break up business as usual. So, having an interest in the built environment myself and having been exposed to, collaborating with architects, you kind of start to understand the full picture and what needs to really be changed in order for, a radical shift in sustainability to happen within this industry. So, at this moment, I was really looking at how do we look at decarbonization transition strategies. And a lot of this, involves huge efforts in decoupling not only business models from resource consumptions, but also, behavior change as well. And so trying to find those avenues and applying it to, what is this hidden metric within the building industry. And for us, that's really come down to examining floor area per person.
From the perspective of an architect and working for many years in a residential project, I will say standard residential project with a standard relationship between the developer, architect, and residents, there is some sort of a problematic what us as architects basing our design decisions. Is it the economic landscape? Is it the market, the housing market? Is it the wish of the developer? And sometimes you have the regulatory restrictions and the architect and the building code, but you always create this fictional user that is a mirror to the market and what the developer wants. And that brings us to a question: how can we design better, create better projects, better sustainable residential developments that actually are tapping into real people and the real needs? I can give a little background to the Make Room. From the personal motivation is this topic of self-actualization. Before moving to Copenhagen, I lived in a 40 square meter apartment that I owned, and I had the opportunity to design it from scratch. And in that 40 square meter, I was very happy, me and my wife. And when we moved here to Copenhagen, we moved to a rental, 80 square meter, double the size, but with a very strict contract that kind of limited our possibilities within the home. So that kind of highlighted the need. And I think we are exploring and identifying that need through our consultancy, Make Room, is to understand what really makes a home, and how we can do it in a systematic way for the mass, for the people, for urban dwellers.
Yeah, and I suppose what we saw from our research was essentially a fact that I'm sure many architects and developers are aware of, but we could see just a massive amount of emissions and consumption associated with the building industry. And the populations are obviously continuing to rise. So at some point, we have to ask the question, like, what is enough to meet our needs? And is there ways that we can rethink how we can live on this planet in a way that, isn't outside of, what our planet can actually maintain? And so I think this is why we were really interested in really examining people's needs more closely in combination with looking at more of these environmental factors in order to actually live well within the limits of the planet. So this is, I suppose, like these guys have been saying, is why we kind of wanted to investigate floor space as a factor. As what we saw was that a lot of reports and research was looking at, operational energy emissions and embodied carbon emissions reductions in order to get to net zero by 2050 or by 2030, as some very ambitious developers have pointed out. And what we saw was that all of these reports were not really taking into account this kind of question of space, of how much people are using. And what we see around the world is that floor space is increasing, of course, at different rates in different societies. You see societies like China increasing rapidly as the middle class is growing. But you see countries like Denmark, which are also steadily increasing. And we kind of thought this was an interesting question to investigate. And that became the subject of our thesis, which we worked on together. And that's now what has come into this research project and our consultancy that we're developing and starting up together.
I think that this is going to be a very important question for the discussion, but also beyond, which is what is enough if it comes to housing. And Denmark is kind of very high on that scale of the room that people get. And you also pinpointed it, Matthew, I think, by saying that the building industry is responsible for an enormous amount of CO2 emissions and resource consumption on the planet as well. So zooming out a little bit, what has to happen for us, people, to start realizing the fact and acting upon it?
I think a great starting point that we found was a whole wealth of research that's emerging, particularly in Denmark, around actually beginning to understand the environmental impacts of construction, and particularly like how they relate to the planetary boundaries frameworks that have been devised in Stockholm. And so there's amazing research at DTU called Absolute Sustainability Assessment, which is looking into downscaling the planetary boundaries to individual industries and to individual people to see how much carbon can we emit in buildings in order to be absolutely sustainable, to live within the limits of the planet for different factors. So CO2 or biodiversity loss or land conversion or water use, all of these factors that we are trying so hard to comprehend and deal with. So these frameworks are really useful starting points, at least in educating those who have the ability to change things in what targets we should actually be meeting. But a large question that we found was, what sort of social metrics are we also trying to achieve in order to live a healthy life? Because we could see that there was a lot of ecological targets being created, with these studies, but not a lot of social ones. The question was, how much space is too small? What sort of studies should we be looking at here? And there's a lot of research that we found from the UN that tries to propose like minimum space standards for dwellings, which I'm sure most architects would be familiar with. But we thought this would be interesting to further explore. What happens if we share space? What happens if we live more flexibly? Does that suddenly open up new opportunities to live with different spaces, with less space, or in different configurations with people? So this was kind of the starting point for our study. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in order for us to realize, what is enough, it can't happen in isolation, right? I think it's a multi-stakeholder approach, and all of these stakeholders need to communicate to each other. Where are these foundations and where are these limits, whether it's for social well-being, for you as the resident living in this space, whether it's for the developer or the architect when it comes to looking at emission standards, or even looking at, at the municipality, how much land is available for residential living.
We do want to realize this fact and act upon it. We already started talking about it. There is a need for a paradigm shift. So in a way, disconnect square meter from the cultural, financial powers that kind of drive it up. As we see in many, many countries, the square meter per capita is on the rise. And there is a correlation with cultural, geographical, demographic. That is one of the indicators of a high level, high standards, and high livability. And we know from our experience and our research that it doesn't necessarily need to be connected. And there are many opportunities to achieve social targets with eliminating that growth in square meter. So that's one of the first steps, is to take paradigm shift of disconnecting square meter with livability.
So it is about the square meters. To just briefly emphasize that everything takes us to the floor area. I just used this quote from the material that you provided me with, that Denmark has one of the highest floor area per person on the planet. That's a big number. And it is forecasted that 113 million square meters of development are expected to be built in Denmark by 2050. During your research, maybe also talking to some friends or some other people and especially Danes, did you ask them, do they know how lucky they are that they have so many square meters? And also, do you think do they really need this much of built space? Is it somehow embedded in the Danish welfare state system, or do really Danes need this much of a space?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point is, what are you comparing yourself to? Yeah, like you say, I think the floor area in Denmark is about 42 square meters per person on average that someone lives on, which is hard to kind of put to understand, maybe in relation to many other countries around the world, but many live on much less and only a few have more, namely Australia, funnily enough, and the United States. So this problem is very close to home for us as well. And it's not just a Danish problem, but a lot of the research we found, particularly looking at the social associations of floor space and well-being, we're trying to kind of uncover this further.
When looking at floor space and well-being and livability, I think this is a growing body of research that is, really being focused on, especially now. Floor area per person is becoming such a target when looking at environmental standards and what should regulations be for new development, or even as what we're advocating for is, can these targets be used in a transformation wave of existing buildings as well? Can we reimagine the built environment as a circular resource and start redistributing some of the square meters, that maybe are unequally distributed right now across metropolitan areas? And so, tapping into this understanding of resource consumption and well-being, there is a diminishing point of return for how much you consume and your well-being related to it. And plenty of studies show that it happens with how much wealth you have, how much material possessions you have. So also finding what that limit is for square meter consumption is super interesting. Where is that diminishing point of return for how much space you actually consume and how much of it is in excess? And of course, this will completely change based on the individual. If you are handicapped or not able-bodied, you require more space because of your situation. But if you are a parent, a couple, and your kids are leaving the house, maybe your need for this space is diminishing at this point. So finding that metric for different demographics, I think, is super interesting, and I think will only propel a greater understanding of how to construct different dwelling models for different demographics or for different points of your life. And I think, touching on your last perspective on whether or not Danes or Westerners in general realize their privilege or how lucky we are, I don't think we do, because we associate so much of our status, so much of our well-being with how big our apartments are or how big our houses are. And I think you can definitely look to like the housing booms in the late 2000s that happened in the US, or these McMansion trends that were happening. And I think because we have this material association with it, I think decoupling that aspect of our relation with space is just as important as decoupling, the industry's need to build big and continue to, pursue this linear track with development.
Align it with the Danish numbers, the 113 million square meter that is forecasted to be built, which of that is, we're talking about 96 million square meter for residential alone. So the direct answer, I think, from our point of view would be, yes, it's needed. But we are questioning where it should be allocated, as Andre started to talk about and touch upon. Is it supposed to be in a new build? And we also want to question, what is this number based on? Is it according to standards that we see nowadays of the average apartment per family and that is being built right now? Or is it the room that we can also question those metrics that define this forecast? So those are the 2 point of views to, first of all, where is it allocated? And is it really needed in the way of what brought us to that number? Can we play with this number? Can we see what is a better fit for a variety of demographics?
I would understand it as a step towards densification in our cities. And this is also the simplified explanation of your project, that you want to transform the existing buildings into creating more healthy and livable communities, housing based on community, on the relation of the residents. And in your research, you are also emphasize the role of sufficiency. What does it exactly mean in terms of your project?
So I think our attraction to this definition of sufficiency, which I think is an emerging sustainability concept beyond circularity, is in what state are our individual human needs met while also respecting the needs of the ecological health of the planet. And I think we were really attracted to this theory because, as being exposed to a lot of circular economic models, these were really focusing on, what is the commercialization elements that we can, make into a more circular function, whether it's materiality, whether it's, looking at different stakeholders along the value chain to become, more efficient in narrowing or slowing these types of loops. But what we really found was the human element was missing. Where were the users? Where was the stakeholder engagement in some of these circular models? And so when we discovered Kate Raworth's donut economics as well, which balances both the planetary health and human well-being in the center of this model, we kind of felt, this is a great opportunity for us to apply this same metric to the built environment and to the, this target of floor area as well.
This is the concept of the ecological ceiling and the social floor. Could you also just briefly explain what does it mean to the listeners?
Yeah, totally. So maybe to the listeners, if you wanted to kind of imagine a corridor, so to speak, and you have a ceiling and you have a floor, and where you are in this corridor, you are, respecting the limits of the planet in terms of resource consumption, but you're also living a pretty good life yourself. Your social well-being is being met, and you're quite happy in this corridor. So the ecological ceiling is kind of defined by this DTU assessment that Matthew mentioned earlier, where they were looking at the construction of new developments and how square meters would have to be downscaled. And these limits were between 8 square meters if you're using traditional concrete materials, or I think it was 20 square meters if you're using more innovative materials like cross-laminated timber. So if you're thinking 8 to 20 square meters from 42 to 50 that people kind of live in right now, that's almost a 50% reduction in space. So, these scientific numbers really pointed us towards what the ecological ceiling is in terms of square meter consumption. But finding that social floor is much more complex because, as we talked about, social well-being is always subjective. So, some of these bodies of research, whether it's the UN or the ICCC, or most recently, as of last month in October, the European Environmental Bureau, they created some policy guidelines for new development limits for floor area per person. And these targets range between 20 and 30 square meters. So you have your ceiling around 20 and the floor around 15, that kind of gives you a starting point, at least, for some nice design guidelines. Try to re-envision and be quite speculative. Can we live in this smaller space? And what does it take from the design side of this equation to make living on this cut of square meters, possible, and to do so with keeping our well-being in mind?
And yeah, the beauty of this kind of theoretical framework and the use of this mechanism that we call sufficiency is that the ceiling, both elements, the social and the kind of environmental, are both subjective and dynamic, and they relate to different geographical context, also cultural. So this corridor is dynamic to a specific location, so we can actually play around it, and it gives us that flexibility to accommodate to different situations, which I think has a great potential.
Yeah, I think it makes it super exciting knowing that, what the ecological ceiling here is in Denmark is going to be completely different than what it might be in Australia or the US. And the social well-being metrics will also change as well. But knowing that, we have created this framework for creating these boundaries, I think is super exciting.
But as Andre was saying, what we also kind of found was that these ecological limits were for new development. And so for the listeners who are scared by the idea of living on 20 square meters or even 8 square meters in a new building, I think it's worth pointing out that if we did find ways to transform existing spaces and not to build new, the idea would be that theoretically you could live with much more space. We don't have the research to look at the emissions of transforming a building and also densifying it to see what is that sweet spot in terms of space. Maybe it's 30 square meters. Maybe it even is closer to 40.
Yeah, and I think this is relating also to the kind of the sharing, and that's touching upon more of the political regulatory systems and the urban development to decide basically the sharing proxies. If we're saying the power of the ecological ceiling, touching upon LCA, life cycle assessment of transforming an existing building in that relationship, takes in a way, the consideration of that individual building. But we need to add here another layer that plays with the sharing. Who reduces more, who we allow to consume more space. And that system needs to be overseen and be strategically designed. Because we know that, we talked about it earlier, there are populations that need more space compared to others. And we need to be kind of sensitive to that also.
Talking about this, about how to design and moving slowly towards the design guidelines as well, you created some kind of data-informed insights, and you say we already started discussing the sharing of the square meters. We also talked about some flexibility and also cutting off the square meters. So less flexible and shared. But how could we, architects or developers, use those insights to transform the existing buildings and reduce the floor space per person? So how could we go basically from this more of the theoretical, methodological level into the design itself and some design principles?
Well, just to give a bit of background into our methodology, when we determined that, we need more concrete numbers to establish a social floor boundary here in Denmark, it really solidified our need for a digital surveying tool to kind of collect the data that we need, the social, the behavioral, and the spatial data to try to inform how to create these design boundaries for the radical transformation of the built environment for some of these human-centered densification goals that we had for ourselves. So we kind of created this digital platform that's somewhat of a mix between prop tech technology as well as like a post-occupancy evaluation tool, where we really zoomed in on what is an ethical way to capture this data that we need about people within their homes, which is such a personal, private space. And we're talking about redistributing this space. So we thought zooming in on practices or routines that you do within your daily life is a great starting point for shifting the paradigm of residential architecture or of dwelling. Because what are these systems made of? But just millions of practices that we do every day by millions of people. So by zooming in on practices, we were really able to understand what are people doing within their homes, how satisfied are they with the amount of space they have to do these routines, and ultimately, who are they doing these routines with? Are they doing them with their partners? Are they doing them with their friends? Are they doing them with their neighbors? And I think what the most important question we asked was, would you want to do this activity with other people? And who would you want to do this activity with? And I think when you are prefaced with this possibility of sharing, it kind of changes your perspective on how you can live differently. Maybe, you've been working at home because you've been in COVID quarantine and you would love to have a group working area in your apartment, to spur your own productivity or to keep yourself accountable. Or maybe you're a parent who wants to not have their living room be also the playroom and maybe would desire a shared space with other parents in the building as well. So by being able to collect this data and aggregate it and analyze it and put it into our methodology, we were able to come up with these sharing mechanisms or these spatial redistribution mechanisms where maybe some people have more than enough space and they can live with less and they're happy. Maybe they are a fan of minimalism, or maybe people want more flexible spaces. Maybe that opens up the possibility of more polyvalent design. Or maybe people really do want to engage in a shared living environment and co-living is more of the profile that fits them.
To add on this methodology that we developed in our process, so this all kind of being put in a frame, we have developed a framework that is employing different sets of algorithms that take different data nodes. And that's how we develop those insights that are to make sure that we get the most amount of knowledge to make good design decisions early on in the stage of planning for future residents, but also the existing residents. And as Andre talked about, it's about getting an overview of the spaces that are required, how you can access them, and what is the network of relationship between those spaces. And I think that is kind of what we're conveying. That is the most meaningful knowledge for developers and also architects, is to get a further developed kind of brief of spaces and understand the type of spaces and how people can share those spaces. And with exact numbers, not to say that we need to accommodate every single person sharing. This is not what it is about, but it is about to get a much bigger information to kind of flush out the outliers of the data. Not to say, okay, we have one standard vision of one human, no matter the gender is or demographic, and that's how they live, like the fixed 90 centimeter height kitchen. That is not right for everyone. We have different heights as humans, and I think a lot of people suffer from having a 90 square meter height kitchen. And I think it's really important to developers, but also architects, because it's not about taking their creative process from them, but is actually giving a bigger kind of picture that they can make those design decisions. I think it also gives them the power. It empowers them to push on the creative side, because they know that a lot of the questionable things that we do as architects in that process is already anchored with data, and it's real and it is true to that specific site that they're working. It's not a knowledge that a specific architect accumulated over 20 years of experience that is, subjective, how he learned this knowledge, he or she, but it is great kind of lens into the current needs.
Yeah, and I suppose another interesting point to add is what we see in a lot of research now, and also with IoT and sensors in office spaces, for example, is we see a lot of data-oriented decision-making through looking at what people do or what spaces people use. But what we really wanted to do in going the next step was to kind of ask people what they could want in the future. What do they actually envision or dream of having in their neighborhood? And so there's some also additional questions we ask were things like, what do you dream of having in your neighborhood? Or what services would you love to have in order to live with less space? Would you love to have shared food or shared kitchen spaces, or have a private chef come into your private living room and give you a meal? So I think it raises the question of what sort of data do we want to collect, and can we actually really make this a co-creative process where we get people excited about what the future of living could be, and not just look at what people have right now as the starting point.
We also understand and we recognize the the limitation of data collection, especially when this data is being collected non-objectively. As Matt said, in offices, we can use IoT systems that objectively kind of read the situation and the data is correct. Here, we use a different way as a process to be very ethically and not invade the privacy of people. And so we do not want to take this approach of sensors and IoT elements. So we are developing our methodology in that way in our process. But we also developed other steps or further steps to kind of create a dialogue about this data. Is it correct? And kind of reflect with the residents together and to question them about the data to see if it's correct. Also simulate along the way the insights that could be developed based on those data nodes. And from that point, we can understand if the data is viable, is it correct, and how we can also push it forward. So from data to insights, yes, we have the digital platform, but we also have different points along this process that can actually improve and justify the insight in a better way without being exposed to the limitation of our data process.
I remember being some time ago in the Danish Architecture Center, and there was the exhibition about living together, and they've been having this playful way of collecting the data. And it was data about what would you like to share in your apartment, in your resident block. And it was a very playful way. You had some containers and you had some plastic balls and you could throw them, emphasizing which place would you share. It could be a living room, a small community working room, or a bathroom or kitchen. I guess that this is something that you've mentioned that you've asked in your research as well. But then I wanted to ask you what you would like to share in your apartments, because it is a very subjective thing. So what would you like to share in your apartments? What you are ready to share?
I can definitely speak from experience here after living in a number of share houses at this stage of my life, that not all sharing is necessarily voluntary. And a lot of the time we make decisions to share because we have to, because our finances don't allow us to live in this beautiful studio by ourselves and have as much space as we possibly like. But I think for me, one thing I've learned from living in flats with 3 or 4 other roommates, or sometimes even more, is that also can have a lot of social benefits. There's a lot of ease in having one person cooking per week in a kitchen. And I've actually come to grow to really love this. And so now for me personally, I've just moved into a new apartment and it's a collective. And that's a choice that I made, even though I could find a studio space with my partner. We actually decided that we wanted to be a part of a larger community so that we could share resources and food and meals together. And that's something that we really love doing. I'd love to have a shared living room, to answer your question very directly, because in this collective, we only have a shared kitchen. So I'm learning the need to have a separate space to just my bedroom and just a space to cook, for example. But I don't feel that needs to necessarily be a private space. And I'd love to have access to a shared space like that. And that's a very basic one. But when you're a student, your finances can only stretch a certain way.
I think from my point of view, I have a different living situation than Matt. I also have a 1.5-year-old baby, my son, and we live 3 people in an 80 square meter apartment. So we're kind of not far from the corridor. If we calculated like that. But in relationship to sharing, I think there is huge potential in sharing spaces that relate to childcare and activity areas for kids. Yesterday, I went with my son to a neighbor who's a friend, and we had a play date in their living room because it was cold outside and we didn't want to stay outside in the rain. The happiness and the effect of going to a different space that is not yours in a way and has new exciting toys and new things to discover. It was amazing to see on my son's eyes. He would never play this way in our own living room. Of course, it is exciting. And if we are sharing it, then it becomes that is your space to visit. But there is this huge potential and huge source in making a space. Sharing also makes it dynamic. The social dynamics of that space, that's what makes it unique. And I think those are the type of spaces I would share personally. The social spaces, the activities spaces, and also focused specifically on raising our younger generation together. Not to say move the responsibility of parenting to other people, but collectively help each other, because it's not easy. Kids in that age, they run a lot. You don't notice, and they're in the other side of the living room and the other side of the apartment. So it is nice, would be nice to be in that kind of shared space that everyone feels this sense of ownership also. Ownership, and we're touching from ownership to maintenance and responsibilities together. That will be very, very helpful in nowadays when we are, as parents, also work a lot. And I think that could take help with the day-to-day pressure.
For me, I'm reminded of, I've also been living in shared living since I finished my bachelor's a few years ago. And one of the best examples of shared space that I remember is, when I was living in Washington, D.C., we had this old carriage house, which was transformed into a garage. And we didn't have cars. We were like only riding bikes and really adamant about not ever needing to buy a car or wear a suit. But we decided to turn this garage into a studio space, a space for creative imagination and possibility. So we built this big wooden table, maybe 2 meters long, and anyone in the neighborhood could come and drop off their paint supplies or their canvas or whatever they were working on and use this space for creative possibility. And I really find that kind of missing in my own living space here, where it's very much divided into, okay, I have 8 square meters of my private space and I have maybe a work desk, and then we have some shared living space, which is super great. But sometimes creativity is messy and it needs to be, and I think the more dynamic and shared it is, I think is really great. And I think, there are also all of these well-being enhancements that being creative brings you. And I think being able to share with that with your neighbors was such a fulfilling thing to offer and provide. And I think that's an element that is not really considered in shared amenities when you look at, what are, these residential buildings offering in terms of maybe it's a gym, maybe it's a co-working space, but maybe more dynamic, flexible opportunities are possible as well.
You've passed the test, guys. I was testing you because I really wanted to hear your opinion and your perspective on living together, on sharing, and on creating the flexible spaces. You've mentioned, Iddo, already before, the paradigm shift that we need to face. And I'm curious about the role of architects and designers in this whole transformation. What do you think that it means for us and then for our creative industry? We've mentioned already that it has to be based on knowledge, on sufficiency as well. But would you say, what would be the first kind of a change, first stimuli for the people working in the industry?
I think a really great first step is getting acquainted with some of these co-creative processes and tools that are being developed by many, many different startups all around the world. I think is a really great point in the right direction. Often architects that I've worked for have still had very traditional working methods and processes, which are very much analog in many ways. And computational design has a very limited role in maybe meeting environmental objectives, not social ones. And so I think architects searching for more of these social insights and trying to work together with the residents that live in these dwellings is a great first step. And that's maybe suggesting that there could be a different focus in architects' day-to-day work potentially, and focusing more on the people that they're designing for, not just the developers that they're serving. So I think that's one really interesting step. And I think also this really opens up a whole new market for transformation for architects. The suggestion that, if we could actually look at new ways of transforming and densifying existing buildings means that, of course, there's a whole lot of new work that could be done where architects have a specific, unique role to play, because architects have a great knowledge of site and context and heritage and aesthetics that's incredibly important for transforming existing buildings. And I think that's a really interesting opportunity because we don't see a huge uptake in renovation projects by architects around the world. And I personally believe that this will be a huge shift that will take place. And so I think that's a really exciting thing.
We are suggesting co-designing, and co-designing does not come without pain, at least from the side of the architect. It is a messy process originally, that you need to take in consideration many, many opinions about your design. And I think that's relating to the paradigm shift that we're talking about here, that it also a paradigm shift within architect, not to say that all architects or designers think that way, but there are some that would prefer to sit behind their desk and make their own design decisions based on their own opinion and their own inspiration. And sometimes the stakeholders, the clients, the residents kind of their voices being hidden and muffled in the background. And that is not what we want to cancel. We don't want to cancel the personal expression of an architect, because I think we think it's a key role within the profession that you do have an outlet for creativity, you do have an outlet for self-expression, but we're trying to help in that process also to reduce the time that you need to think about which type of spaces and defining the brief and go over that, so you could have more time exploring what you do want to explore, which is mainly the design. So it is not about limiting the role. It's providing a bigger and clear picture on the project.
Make Room is presenting 3 speculative futures. Let's just talk about them. You have those 3 stages, 3 visions, 3 possible futures for the change in the apartments in Copenhagen, but not only. You've been working on the real side, actually. You've chose, or maybe you can just explain in a minute. You are building this community prototype, and it is here in Copenhagen in Christianshavn, and it's called the Applebys Plus. What exactly happens in there? Is it like your live laboratory? Can you just accumulate some practical knowledge from this experiment and then share it with the designers? And how does the process look like?
The prototype that you mentioned is actually the starting point for our thesis project, which we've now developed into this company. And so what we found from our research was that we were missing a lot of insights on how people live. And in order to test our data collection methods, we thought, well, we need to work with people. We need to find a site where we can actually ask people questions and find out if what we're suggesting is actually possible. And so both Iddo and I happened at the time to be living in the same residential development, and this is Applebys Plus. And so we thought this is a great space to start with because we know the people who live there and we have relationships with many of the people who live there already. So we can already get some interesting insights from that.
Yeah, I think it's important to say in that element of trust. We did the prototyping in the first run of our platform in COVID time. So we had to emphasize this trust so people would participate and will trust us that we're not just strangers, coming off the pandemic and spreading diseases. So it was kind of important for us.
Yeah, but on top of the kind of necessity during COVID of picking this site, we also found that it was really ideal for several reasons. And one of those was that floor area per person is very high in Christianshavn compared with other neighborhoods in Copenhagen. And so we thought strategically it would be an interesting starting point because there could be great room for reduction in space or densification. And on top of that, we also saw that there was a complex range of apartments. There was 140 apartments and they ranged in square meters from 62 to 190. And in addition, we also saw a great constellation of different demographics. So it was a really great starting point for a test for us because we could look at both families and singles and couples, collectives living together. So this was kind of why we thought this site would be an interesting test bed for us to develop some of our methods and our methodology. And that's sort of the first step for us.
The site had 140 apartments. Yes, but when we kind of start analyzing, we noticed, first of all, that there is only 40 types of apartments in the complex that had a lot of similarity of the space. It was more or less copy-paste of the specific spaces with different numbers of rooms. So if we had a 70 square meter apartment, it was very similar even to the 100 plus square meter apartment. So that kind of created a clear way of how to examine those spaces with different opinions about similar space. That, it's a bit, I constructed it in a bit of a weird way, but I think the matching points between the apartments, although in a way this richness, we say 140 apartments, but eventually it was very similar how people lived in those spaces. So that kind of highlight also the standardization element in our investigation. And we could have an opinion on that thing, which is how we designed a standard and not to subjective people.
And it was super interesting, moving through these different data collection phases with these residents at Applebys Plaza and seeing when we're getting the first round of data and seeing, who they are keen to share with or how they're keen to share with or in what dream activities are they imagining for their neighborhood or for themselves. And then luckily, once some of the limits around gatherings kind of ended here in the spring and we were able to kind of have a community a barbecue with some of the people who participated in the digital survey. And, we got to kind of hear on their firsthand opinion, what they were looking for, what they imagined different types of living for them or their families to be like. And ultimately for them to say, wow, this is so nice. We never get to gather. We don't have a place in the building to congregate as a community. And so it was just really encouraging for us as well to kind of put some qualitative insights to some of these just more number analytical approaches that we had been doing in our Excel tables and in our pie charts. But because, we had such a diverse range of demographics, we also realized that, trying to place these residents of this residential block into the sufficiency corridor of 30 square meters that we had outlined would be a challenge. And, of course, we were operating in a speculative, creative vacuum. So we also wanted to be very provocative and where we could push this idea. But also thinking strategically, we thought about, what are some incremental steps that we could take with these residents or with this residential unit that could slowly over time shift how we relate to our spatial consumption. So, one of the first futures that we imagined was more of a community-led movement of maybe this platform that we've developed operates more as like a prop tech software where you can communicate, I have this extra guest room that I don't use. Maybe someone who needs to work from home can use it because, they maybe have kids that are, using the common space in their apartment. And this allows more interconnectivity between the residents themselves. And a big part of our research was also looking at what is the impacts of sharing on well-being and what is, this concept of interdependency. And, sharing itself leads to well-being because you emulate reciprocity and mindfulness while you're engaging in this act. So when you're able to facilitate sharing as well, theoretically, you should also be able to enhance the well-being of those who want to participate in sharing. And I think that's really what the community-led movement is more about, optimizing underutilized spaces. And it's more of there's less physical alteration of the building in this first future that we imagined. And it's more just leveraging the desire of the residents themselves to connect with each other.
So this is this kind of a first step, this subtle change, so to call it. And what is the next step, the next speculative future out of those three?
Yeah, so the next step for us, I suppose, started by asking one key question, which was how much space could we reduce if we met everyone's desires for both sharing and also privacy at home? And so this was the starting point for us, looking back at our data and looking at how can we actually design these spaces so that they can actually facilitate the different group sizes and group dynamics for everyone's routines in their homes. And so what we actually looked at was we took a stairwell of one of the buildings as sort of this repeated module of how we could intervene within this building development and kind of say, where can we provide shared spaces that actually respond to the group sizes that they wanted for, say, cooking or eating together or for exercising or working from home. And so what we found was that I think there was about 24% of people who still didn't want to share it all and still wanted private space. So we also wanted to make room on the top floors for people to have micro apartments or more flexible apartments that didn't actually need to share with anyone. So we were still trying to meet the needs of those people that didn't want to share and still wanted to have private space. But then on some floors, we proposed more centralized common cooking spaces or eating spaces or even party spaces, which was something that everyone really wanted was party spaces for 20 or more guests, which we didn't have access to in this building. And what we ended up with was a building with really unique floors and that really tailored the spaces to different groups. And that was something which, we were really excited by it as an outcome.
Yeah, the scenarios that we developed, I think, of course, everything that we mentioned so far, but they really different from each other in the amount of effort. Because we also recognize, obviously, that the scenarios, they live within an existing landscape that has financial constraints in relationship to how much you're going to change and what are the physical acts you're going to do to, let's say, walls, structural elements, vertical shafts, elevators. So between those steps, and we explain what we developed in our third, most radical, took those points to the extreme. In a way, eliminated those financial strains, really radicalized the building from a floor plan. One floor plan, we took it as an experiment, and we asked, how can we meet the ecological ceiling the best? Meaning to reach a 20 square meter per capita on average in the floor. In our specific building, in our site, Applebee's Platz, that meant more than doubling the existing amount of people living within the complex. So what we've developed is a complete shift in the ownership. We eliminated the personal ownership and rent model that exists there of individual apartments. We spread all the practices in a originally different way. We utilized more of the insights related to concerns and motivations and services that people would love to have in order to share more spaces. And we radicalized the concept of a home. We did leave some spaces private, let's say the sleeping, of course, taking showers, getting dressed, all those things were kind of private. Also, the way we designed the layout was to create privacy between those functions. And then you have this kind of a flow to more public sharing spaces that people can interact. They can decide in some spaces what they want to have. So not everything is fixed. There are a lot of flexible spaces that they can be further determined and be democratized by the residents themselves. And yeah, that was the radical sufficiency transition that we proposed. Not to say that this fits everyone. At the end, we suggested a 6 square meter private space, but you had access and you could use 524 square meter per person, which is much more than what we have right now. So it's not only about reducing, we're talking about a lot of reduction here, but it's about also gaining the space that you need also now, but your need also going to change in a month. So we also facilitate that in our framework that you could change the spaces you can decide and kind of tailor the life you want within the building through the different spaces. So yeah, that's the shift from ownership to usership as a concept of living, from 70 square meter apartment to 6 square meter as a private to 500 plus square meter of usage.
The great thing that we found here was that living with less can also be a benefit to every individual, and you can have access to, we found 7 times more space than you usually would. And this was something that I think all of us were really excited by, was this idea that maybe we could have access to spaces that we just don't in our current financial circumstances, and we could be paying less rent, which would also open up new opportunities for engaging in the city and not just in our own home.
To conclude our discussion, I will ask you $1 million question, which is how to make it work. Because we talked about this paradigm shift, and we also talked about this live laboratory that you were lucky to have at Applebee's Platz. But as you are all, I'm pretty sure, aware, lowering the comfort and also social and financial status associated with large housing can be a struggle, because the challenge I see here is that people were created as beings craving for comfort all the time, especially in the long winter days that we are experiencing right now here in Copenhagen. We would just love to light up some candles and just chill in our apartments. So do you think that people will be willing to give out some extra square meters of their coziness to provide more people with the housing possibilities? This is a bit of coming back to the beginning of our discussion where we talked about how big apartments do Danes have. Do you think that the Danes and also other people in other countries in the Western societies would be willing to compromise a bit for the common sake?
So first of all, I think, yes, we do think that. You presented it as, people wouldn't let go of their comfort, but that's in a way kind of not what we are saying. We're not saying let go of the comfort, don't enjoy your space, share everything and be miserable. No, it's about kind of disconnecting. Is it comfort? Is it a direct connection to square meter? Can comfort be achieved through other means in a way? And can you find cozy in maybe a shared constellation? I think to those answers, we can say yes. From our experience, we can always sit in a cozy coffee place. This is not a space that you own, but it's a space that you occupy, and people respect your occupation, occupying that space. So we have kind of a different norms, social norms that allow you to enjoy this cozy space. And I think we see it as achievable in the concept of dwelling. As we also mentioned, that's also how we see the thing. It's about what are you gaining? It's not about letting go. It's what are you gaining. And we touched about it. We can also see a reduction in financial strain in this. We can see reduction in maintenance, self-responsibility, a lot of elements that could actually increase your overall comfortability, that you don't have financial stress in your life, that you need to pay this high rent for that space that you might not be using.
Coming out of a few years of lockdowns and having to go through different stages of quarantine, people talk about loneliness and they talk about isolation. And I think these are, I think these were prevailing trends within architecture and urban development, even before the COVID-19 pandemic was, how do we talk about loneliness as, the other pandemic of this generation? And whether that's talking about people who are more isolated because of technology, or maybe they're more isolated because, you're part of the aging demographic of society. And I think the idea of comfort is definitely subjective and it's a state of mind. And I think by proposing an alternative that doesn't exist right now is maybe something that people really can't imagine because they haven't experienced it yet. And I think that's kind of what we're looking to propose. And I think there's a lot of different interesting models of co-living and intergenerational living. And I think we would just like to capitalize on that through the transformation of existing buildings. I think for us, it's showing a viable alternative to maybe their large empty apartment that they currently occupy now.
I wanted to ask the ending question, which will be tricky, I think. I don't want to be mean, but what you are proposing is brilliant in terms of sustainability and especially the sufficiency and the model that you came up with. But by 2050, Copenhagen population is expected to increase by 130,000 people. And if we don't build new spaces and instead make room within the existing building stock, we could house everyone by simply reducing the floor area per person by 7 square meters. But how to make it in the midst of crazy visions for a city of Copenhagen like Lynetteholmen? This is a project that is about to be built, consuming the enormous amounts of soil that would be served to create a huge artificial island housing about 50,000 people. So how to convince people? I think it's easier with the residents, but how to convince the policymakers as well that the more kind of beneficial in terms of sustainability, in terms of finance and so on, model is to add additional spaces in the existing ones instead of creating these huge visions that are completely unsustainable.
So first of all, I think we have a meeting with a politician tomorrow, so we can let you know how it went. And yeah, we'll definitely test how it works in that, in the political level. What is the resistance, if there is a resistance, and how we can work with that level. I think in general, we identify as the political level very important in our process. The decision-making, the regulatory system, we do see them as potential partners and needed partners towards this transition and process that we suggest. Not to say that they got it wrong in that project or in any other project. I think it's important to say that our strategic approach is to look at the existing buildings and question the need for new build while optimizing and analyzing the existing ones, that we can use the spaces that we have as a resource.
I wanted to wish you good luck with the talk with the politician, because I think that this is always like this crucial step to start when you go from this mode of being a startup and basing on the research, where you start applying this into the firm physical steps. So that's why I really wish you luck with that. And I think that we need solutions like this. So I hope that the meeting gonna be successful, and it's gonna be the successful first step towards the more radical changes in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's trying to see, do they want to hold the carrot or do they want to hold the stick? Like what role does the regulatory or political body want to play in regards to, shifting the trend of, reallocating focus from new development to the transformation of the existing building stock. And I think, when you're looking at these big developments like Lynetteholm, I mean, there's a lot of industry stakeholders that, of course, are always going to want to advocate for new development, and whether that's coming from construction or raw material providers. I mean, I think there's opportunities for intervention with Lynetteholm, to make it more as sustainable as possible when you're talking about creating an artificial island. So, I mean, I think that's itself is its own paradox that they kind of have to figure out and solve. But like, as Iddo was saying, I think what we're trying to present is that there is a viable alternative, but it's just bringing all of these stakeholders to the table to show the innovative potential in seeing space as a resource.
Iddo, Matthew, and Andre, thank you very much for this conversation. It was extremely interesting to me, and I hope that the listeners also enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for listening to the newest episode of Urbcast. I hope that you learned something and that you were inspired by Andrew, Matthew, and Iddo. I think that this is a very brilliant idea to decrease the amount of space we have because we don't use it efficiently enough. So instead, can we just meet the new way of living, the sufficient living, which will enable us to accommodate more people without adding more new developments? I hope that the answer is quite clear. And I also hope that you like the conversation. If you would like to get to know something more, you can contact the guys through LinkedIn, for example, or visit their website, makeroom.online. Thank you very much for listening not only to this episode, but also to the many different episodes in English that I published this year. Since this is the closing episode, the grand finale, I wanted to say that I am very, very thankful for your support. I have been receiving many messages from you, many of them through LinkedIn, with you saying that you like the episodes or that the things I talked about were interesting or that you made some new connections with my guests. And that's the exact aim of this podcast, to bring people closer to the important matters in urbanism, in architecture, urban planning, and so on. I wish you great New Year 2022. And I hope that you will continue to listen to this podcast because I'm planning extremely interesting topics in the next year. And I just hope that you're going to stay with me. If you would like to share anything, any comment, any question, feel free to reach out to me through my social media, email, or my website. One more time, thank you very much and talk to you next year.